welcome to Girl Talk, a virtual panel series brought to you by Girl Up. For those of you who aren't familiar, Girl Up is a movement to advance the skills, rights, and opportunities of girls to be leaders. And simply put, that just means that we believe in the power of girls. And we're working to make the world a better place for every girl, everywhere. My name is Rahkendra. I'm the Communications and Digital Media Manager for Girl Up. And I'm joined today by a few panelists who are going to talk to us today about storytelling. We have Dr. Ariana Curtis, Jennifer Pepperman, and Aria, who is our great teen advisor. So I want to let everyone know that we'll answer questions a little bit later on, so feel free to use the Q&A box to submit your questions. And I'll kick it off to our panelists to introduce themselves. We're talking today about storytelling because we know that every great movement starts with a story, and our stories matter. So Dr. Ariana, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Hi everyone. Thank you, Girl Up, for having me. Hi to my panelists. I'm sorry I can't see you in person. And everyone for tuning in. So I am a curator at the Smithsonian. I work at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And my area of specialty is Latinx studies. So really briefly, and as relevant to our conversation today, what a curator does is we work with the collections, like all the objects and images that museums have, and we also help build those collections. So we're the people who get to decide what's important and why it's important, and kind of contextualize what that has to do with our shared history and culture, and why the Smithsonian should preserve it. So we create exhibits, and we give talks, and we publish articles. So that's what I'm excited to talk to you all about today, and bring to the conversation, is thinking about all of the different ways that we can tell stories. How I tell a story through a museum exhibition is going to be very different than when I'm giving, a public presentation, even though they're both storytelling. So thinking about what makes a good story and who's your audience, and for me, what history I can bring to that, and how I can use things from the museum so that people think history is interesting.
Awesome. Jen?
Hi, so I'd like to thank Girl Up for having me. I'm very excited to be here, and I wish I could see talk to all my panelists and see everyone in person, but thank God we have this technology that we can do things like this. So just a little bit about me. I currently write and produce for the WWE for Friday Night SmackDown. I have a background, I come from soaps. I worked on As the World Turns, One Life to Live, and Guiding Light. So my storytelling is from the dramatic type storytelling. And I'm excited to talk about, a little bit about what my process is.
And last but certainly not least, Aria.
Hi, I'm Aria. I'm so excited to be here, and hi to my panelists and all the girls watching. I am a teen advisor at Girl Up. I'm a graduating senior this year, and I will be attending New York University in the fall. I will be studying journalism, which is a very important element of storytelling. And I'm also the co-founder of a youth-led initiative, Asians Lead. One of the issues that I really care about is the lack of representation of Asian Americans in media and in movies and in arts, all that stuff. So one thing that my organization is trying to do is to tell the story of Asians, because we don't really see that in the mainstream media platform, and we want to be that platform. We want to tell the world the stories that are usually unheard, and I think Girl Up is doing the same. Girl Up is also a so important platform for girls all around the world to amplify their voice and to tell their stories. So I'm also one of those girls.
You certainly are. Thank you all for being here today. I'm curious now, because all of you have sort of long careers in storytelling, whether you realize it or not. And I'm just curious, when did you first realize that you were a storyteller? Aria, let's start with you.
Okay, great. I think I first realized that I was a storyteller when I joined Girl Up, because I think before joining Girl Up, I was actually not very familiar to activism, and Girl Up kind of opened a new world to me. And especially, before Girl Up, I didn't really think that my stories mattered. because they're just my history. Like my family's my family. Like they've always been there, and I just didn't think that anybody would want to know about it, But then I joined Girl Up, and I met all these amazing girls, especially my class of teen advisors. We are, I think, the most diverse class of teen advisors. So everybody comes from a different background. Everybody has their own unique stories to tell, and just seeing those girls telling their stories and being so confident about their past, about their background, it kind of empowered me to tell my stories. And whenever I talk about my life in public or to other girls, and they're all like, wow, like you've been through that, or like, wow, that's so powerful, So I was raised in Shanghai, China, and I was raised by a single mother, and I had kind of a sexist father who like didn't care about me at all, and I never thought that it's anything special. But then when I tell these things to other people, and they're like, wow, that's your mother's is such a strong woman, and that inspires me a lot. So that's when I realized that storytelling is such an important tool for activism. And I think joining Girl Up helped me realize that anybody can be a storyteller. Anybody has a great story to tell, and Girl Up provides that kind of platform for girls to tell that kind of story. So
Jen?
So I have an unusual sort of path for my current job now. When I worked in, so actually I'm just gonna dive right in and tell a little story. So when I first graduated, I went to Syracuse University, and I have a BFA in acting. And when I first graduated, I moved to New York City, and I was pursuing acting. But after a couple of years, it bothered me that acting was not a merit-oriented profession. It didn't matter how good you got at your craft, you couldn't necessarily make a living. So I got into production on Guiding Light. I was Xeroxing scripts and answering phones, and I worked my way all the way up into different positions. And mostly on the soaps, I was a director, which is totally a type of visual storytelling. I had written in college. And I think when I was working on As the World Turns and I became a director, I realized, so when I was a teenager, and this is gonna sound a little bit funny, but maybe some of the girls out there relate to this. So I was boy crazy. So I used to imagine what I would say to this boy I liked, and imagine these scenarios, and I would picture them in my mind. And years later, I realized one thing as a director: if you can imagine it in your mind, you can shoot it. So I realized, as I was sort of fantasizing about my crushes, that I was actually sort of directing little movies and scenarios in my head. So that is the first thing that made me realize that I was a visual storyteller. And then in terms of writing, and I thought it was very interesting what Aria said, I believe, especially when you first start to write, I believe most people write what they know. And if you want to be a writer and you're interested in pursuing any type of creative writing, you may feel very comfortable writing from your imagination. But I believe not everybody writes from their imagination. I believe people really write what they know. So writing about your family, writing about yourself, because I believe in a creative medium that your talent is really unique to you. And what your talent is who you are as a person, your sensitivities, how you understand the world. When you listen to a piece of music, how it makes you feel. When you see something, your impulses, who you are as a person, that really is your talent, and it's unique to you. The way you see the world, no one else sees the world in that way. So I think with writing, a lot of people, when they first start to write what you know. Don't be afraid to write what you know, because it will have your point of view, which is unique to you. And another thing about writing, even keeping a journal, one of the things that makes you a good writer is writing and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. So that's a little bit about sort of my storytelling journey.
Ariana, how about you?
Well, I always appreciate being invited to things like this because storyteller is not really something that I use to describe myself. And I think once I accepted it as something that someone else might use to describe me was really after I gave a TED Talk. So I spoke at TED Women in 2018. And I think I just kind of rejected that label or that identity because I just took myself too seriously, you know? And I'm a scholar, you know, so it's just like story to me, like that word just felt less serious. But when I, you know, took a step back, I realized that what people were actually saying was that the way that I expressed my idea, we'll call it, was interesting and accessible, right? Which doesn't make it any less true or any less history-based or any less factual. I think that's when I started to kind of embrace that terminology, like, okay, what people are saying is that they actually enjoyed what I just shared with them. And then realize that really it's a high compliment for someone to consider you a storyteller.
Absolutely. I think there might be some people who are wondering, like, what does storytelling have to do with gender equality? Like, why does it matter, like, if these stories are being told? And I think Aria made a great point earlier where not seeing yourself has an effect, whether that means you're not seeing women's stories, girls' stories, or stories that represent your cultural or ethnic background. And I'm curious to know from each of you what that has been like. Do you find that it has been challenging to sort of see yourself or sort of push stories that represent identities other than those that are already represented in the mainstream?
I think I could jump in on that, considering when I first started working for the WWE about 3 years ago, I was the only woman on the writing team. And wrestling, I worked with all men, and a lot of the men's stories were sort of on the forefront. And so I was a voice for the women on the roster to make sure that the women on the roster were getting, you know, equal time as men. And I think it's very important. I think it's very important to continue to, you know, push those boundaries. And a year ago at WrestleMania, women for the first time ever main event at WrestleMania. So that was really a huge accomplishment. And the WWE has been all about, you know, making sure the women on the roster are treated equally to the men and have equal story. And I think it's very important always to push boundaries and have different voices heard.
Yeah, I can jump in there too. So I self-identify as Afro-Latina. I'm African-American and Latina. So my dad is Black Panamanian and my mom is African-American. And so there's a lot of, you know, personal element into wanting to work at the National Museum of African American History and studying Latinx studies and really pushing forward Black-centered and Latinx-centered narratives as part of the Smithsonian. But I think what's been really interesting for me in this role, and again, this is totally just me taking myself so seriously or thinking a scholar had to be a particular kind of way, and not always wanting to include my personal story into the work that I was doing, right? I didn't want people to kind of feel like my authority only rested within what I knew personally and not necessarily my scholarship. And so I think for me, learning to integrate that in ways that, you know, just allow people to connect with you, right? Facts are facts, but they want to know why it matters to me and how I see myself in these stories. And I think, again, self-identifying as Afro-Latina and just understanding that stories matter from production to completion, right? And so, you know, kind of piggybacking on what Jen was saying, it matters that women tell stories because it is part of that knowledge production. So it's not necessarily women as subject, right? As women through a male gaze or Latinx studies through someone else's gaze, but that we who identify that way are part of the creation of the story itself. And so I think there's just so much power in what Girl Up is doing, what all of my panelists are doing, and just remembering that it's coming from you, and that really, really matters.
Wow, I love that. And I also haven't seen myself represented a lot growing up. I come from a Catholic school. It's like very predominantly white, and I was in my school's broadcasting team. And I'm also not an English native speaker. So I always like hesitated to do stuff, to like join things, you know, because I was always so insecure about myself. And like when I joined the broadcasting team, I think I was the first non-native speaker student to join. And I never, even then, like even after I joined it, after I, you know, became so confident on camera and all that, I still didn't think that I would, you know, make it in journalism or in broadcasting. It's actually until one time through Girl Up, I met a non-native speaker journalist. I think Rahkendra definitely remembers. It's last year I saw Mariana Atencio speak. Yeah, I think that's the time that I was like, wow, like that's somebody like me, you know, that's a girl, an immigrant girl like me, and she made it. Like she wrote a book and she's a famous journalist. That's truly powerful. So, and I think I heard somebody say to me, it's definitely also through Girl Up. Somebody said, when you don't see yourself on TV, when you don't see yourself represented, you go out there and you be that person. So that's kind of what I've been doing. So I was like, well, I don't see people like me in the field that I want to go into, you know, screw it. Like I'm gonna be that person. Also, I'm a senior now. So a couple months ago, I was doing college search and all that. And I got accepted to like an acting school and like schools communication arts, and in those the Asian American demographic is so low. They have like 2% Asians or like 5% Asians, you know, so it's really not a traditional path for many immigrants or Asian American youth. So that's kind of what I've been doing. Is I want to be the representation, and I want people to see themselves represented on TV and, you know, in all those big stages. So.
Yeah, I think that this concept of representation is a really powerful one. And I think that it also comes with a misconception that if I see someone who looks like me, that person represents the entire breadth of what it means to be whoever they are. Like they represent all of the identities that they are at once. But of course, we know that women are not a monolith, cultures are not monoliths. So I want to talk a little bit about that sort of dichotomy. Like, what's it like if you're not, storytelling matters, I think Ariana said, from production all the way through to completion. So like, let's talk a little bit about the back end. Like, it's great to see someone who looks like you, who sounds like you, who has the same sort of experiences as you. But what does that look like on the back end? Whether you're sort of writing for these characters or experiences, or Ariana, if you're curating all of these experiences for sort of more public consumption, whether or not those other people who will be experiencing this are of the culture or not, what's that process like? Where it's sort of like the behind the scenes part of storytelling.
I'll just briefly say that for me, that was really the reason why I have become a little bit more public about the work that I do. So for example, exhibitions at the Smithsonian, they're not authored, you know, so you can go into an exhibit and it won't necessarily say who the curator is. And so, you know, there are pros and cons of that, but I recognize, particularly for the work that I do with Latinx studies, because there's so few Latinx curators at the Smithsonian, that it matters to the audience to know, particularly people who self-identify in that way, it matters to know that the creation, right, the source material for this was someone who has at least some nominally shared identity, right? Particularly for, like I said, like you don't want you don't want it to be through someone else's lens, like your personal experience, something that you hold so dear to you, through the lens of someone who does not share that experience. You know, so it became more important for me to say, like, yes, I identify as Afro-Latina. Yes, it is a Latina who has created these Latinx-centered exhibitions. Yes, it is an Afro-Latina who works at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, you know, just to kind of create those connections, or at least be honest and upfront about that. And also just thinking about museums, I think so much goes unspoken or unarticulated, that we think that there's some universal history or some universal lens through which we tell history. And so it really makes a difference to be able to say, this is the perspective from which this came, right? Personally, or for discipline or the museum mission, so that we can start naming particularly invisible whiteness and maleness, right? And saying, well, that is that perspective. Let's name it so that we can really understand what a diversity of perspective means and what that actually looks like.
Yeah, feel free to jump in, Aria or Jen.
Yeah, I agree with that. Wow, I love that so much. The invisible whiteness and the invisible maleness is, wow. Like I was taking a class at Stanford University last summer about gender equality, gender studies and stuff. And we were reading a book. It's called The Invisible Women. It's like, we don't realize how the world is designed for men. Like, you know, like somebody invent like a medicine and they would choose males to test on, to experiment on. And like car seats are designed for male bodies, or like we're so used to like the default male concept. So like somebody's a man unless stated otherwise. So I think it's so unfair that women are so neglected in history, and honestly in all areas of life. Like we're so neglected and so silenced to like, oh, one thing really interesting that I observed is like the office temperature is the standard office building temperature is set for male bodies, not female bodies. Yeah. That's why so many women feel so cold in work in offices. And I just think like if that's how we're gonna do things, like how can we expect women to succeed in workplace when they're always cold, you know, when the glass doors are too heavy. So I think it's so important to get that message out there through storytelling, and, you know, through whatever means, to let people know that we exist, like girls and women exist, and we deserve to be treated better, to be treated equally. And I think that's so important, and I love what Dr. Curtis said.
So I'll jump in now. So with my background on soap operas were always traditionally thought of as a woman's medium. So, you know, sort of growing up creatively, writing and directing on a soap opera, a lot of the stories did have a focus on women. And it was really a very unusual sort of, in terms of production. A lot of episodic TV shows are very, very male dominated. So on the soaps, it was a really great place to work creatively because there were always women executive producers, women directors, women writers. So that was always very empowering, because I grew up in a production world seeing women were in charge. There were men in charge too, but because soap operas were originally considered a woman's media, women were always in charge. And then I moved over to the WWE, where the wrestling world was sort of much more male focused. Although I have to say, through the voice of our fans, the WWE has been really great about putting women's stories first and women's stories at the forefront. So that's been really exciting to sort of work creatively as part of that transition was happening at the WWE. And in terms of, you know, storytelling, in the wrestling world, it's very different than in the dramatic world, but it's also very similar, because we look for good dramatic stories of why these two people are fighting. So lots of times with women, we did a story on bullying, which was really very empowering. This one bad character was bullying this good character, and the good character overcame the bullying. So it was a very sort of empowering story and a fun story to write, with really saying, you know, it's okay to be who you are.
I love that. I love that. I think that brings up a really interesting point too, where I'm not sure that people realize that the production of stories is collaborative. So what is it like to work with teams? Like, you're not necessarily telling your own story, but you still got to make sure that your story is a good one. So what's that process like, where you have to work together with people who may be different or people who may be the same to produce a story that is good, no matter where it sort of originated from?
I can kind of jump in on that. Having worked in a lot of different writers' room, a writer's room is a really fun, creative place, and everyone wants to get their story ideas out there. And one thing that I think is really important in a writer's room is some people, when they're pitching and going back and forth, they only listen to the next thing in their mind that they're going to say. And so I think when you're in a creative environment and everyone is pitching stories, it's very important to hear what the other person is saying. And it can be I believe the creative process is best when it's collaborative. So you can have a pitch about this is going to happen, and this person's going to do this, and this character is going to do this, but then this is going to happen. But if you're open, someone can listen to that and say, hey, well, what if this happened? And then you're like, oh my God, that's so exciting. So in the WWE, just like any other writer's room, we sort of, we've recently told this story about with the characters of Otis and Mandy, and it's been a love story, and they were sort of, he had a crush on her, and then her best friend betrayed her, and she was dating another guy, and then someone revealed that her best friend had betrayed her, and so it was really like this big soap opera story. But it was so fun in the writer's room to sort of, you know, hash that out. You know, one time someone, you know, will go off on a tangent and say, these people should do this, you know, the character should do this, and then someone's like, oh no, they can't do that, and then someone will sitting back will say, well, wait a minute, you said this, let's put them together, and then we have a whole new story. So I think it's very important to not only pitch from your point of view, but also to listen to other people's point of views, because sometimes someone else can make your idea better. And I also feel like in pitching, people should never be afraid to pitch anything. They shouldn't be afraid for people to say, oh no, that's a ridiculous story, that would never happen, or we could never do that. So I feel like there's a certain amount of trust that needs to happen in a writer's room. You have to trust the people that you're working with and the people that you're pitching with. But I believe as long as you know, sort of pitch from your heart and pitch from your gut, you know, it's always a positive thing.
I can also jump in. Like I said before, I'm in my school's broadcasting team, and my teacher, she's a former newscaster in New York. So like we kind of have that newsroom intensity in our team. By the time I'm a senior, I was a news producer. So I was kind of like leading my peers. And I think that's the hardest thing in the world, is to lead your peers, like, because we're friends, you know, like outside of the classroom, we're friends, like we hang out, we chill. But in that newsroom, like I'm your producer, like I'm your leader, you gotta report to me. And when I tell you that I need this by this time, you gotta get this to me. And it's so hard to be, you know, to be tough on people, to like say that, to you know, like tough up and say I'm your leader. And I think that's really hard. But once you get it, once you tell them that, okay, like we have a deadline and we're a team and we all want to do this, we all want to make our show better, so you should get this to me, and we have this common goal. So I think that's so important. And I think student leadership is very important to develop. And I believe that this kind of skill or ability will help me in the future if I ever get to like writer's room or the actual newsroom or anything. Hopefully that'll help me to lead in the future.
Sure, I'll just jump in and say, one of the things that I appreciate about my job is like all of the different kinds of ways that I get to tell stories. And so some of it is individual and some of it is collaborative from the content production standpoint, right? So with exhibitions, you have an exhibition team. And so there may be an exhibition idea, but it is so useful to have multiple people from different perspectives and different parts of the exhibition in the room to, you know, kind of work through what works, you know, what is clear, what's too murky a story, like what is visually interesting, what's not visually interesting, even though you may really be tied, you know, to that piece of art or that object, and you think it's really important, but no one else is there with you, you know, and just kind of recognizing where you need to collaborate, where you need to assert yourself as a leader. But I've also done a lot of individual things or things that have been a little bit more personal. And so one of, I think for me, that becomes a larger struggle. So when I was working on my TED Talk, TED had speaker coaches, you know, and it was less about the content that they were coaching you and more about the delivery, right? And so that was just a different kind of collaboration, and one that I've also really started to enjoy, knowing when you need to collaborate with people and for what purpose, right? Because sometimes things are really personal to you and you're really the only person who can speak to that content, you know, but you do need ideas on how it's coming across, how you're presenting it. Is it really a compelling story in the way that you're telling it? You know, so when to look for feedback and when not, and when, you know, sometimes it's your voice that needs to lead and when to step back and listen to people is all part of the process.
Yeah, so what's that part like? I think it's difficult. We're talking a little bit about writers' rooms, that collaborative process of storytelling. What's it like if you have to let your story go, so to speak? Like if your story sort of changes from its inception to become a different story, like what's that like? Is it something that you're willing to do sort of for the greater good of the story? Like how do you make the decision between, no, this is the story that needs to be told, compared with, you know, a collaborative story where we're all sort of working together, especially as we're talking about elevating girls' and women's voices, making sure that we're represented, that our stories are heard. Yeah. How do you make that call when you're in a collaborative environment?
I'll share a story about a book that we worked on at the Smithsonian. It was institution-wide, you know, so there were people from all different museums and research centers and departments. And so there was one lobby where I was successful and one where I was not, you know? So we were, you know, thinking about representation, and, you know, I was kind of looking at the different Latinas who were presented in this book, which is called Smithsonian American Women. And so it's through our American Women's History Initiative, which is all across the institution. And it's a book of objects from all over the institution that represent women's history. It's a really beautiful book. I'm super biased, but I'll tell you that. So we were looking at the Latina representation in the book. And I said, you know, not through the whole group, you know, I talked just to the core editorial committee. And I said, I know that you feel like you have Latina representation here, but a lot of these women, particularly early on, you know, because it's chronological throughout history, I was like, early on had careers because they were white passing. And so you actually don't have any Black Latinas in this book. And so I brought up Celia Cruz, who's in 5 different Smithsonian Museum collections, you know, so to say, not only should she be included because this representation is missing from this women's history book, but just, you know, Smithsonian-wide, multiple museums have identified her as important enough to collect and preserve. And so we should really think about, you know, adding her. And so she was added to the book. A place where I was not successful was, so it's a book, right? The things need to be visually interesting. And so there are a lot of collections we have that are good stories if you're telling a story, but not visually interesting for a book. And so I was trying so hard to get this pen. So it's literally just a pen with the NBA logo to represent Michelle Roberts, who's the first woman who's the executive director of a male pro sports union. And they were like, look, Ariana, we're not saying that she's not important. We're saying no one wants to look at a large picture of a pen, you know? So for this book project, you're gonna have to let that go. So I did let it go, but it did show up on the website, you know? So there was a more interesting way to tell that story, that the book was just not the right medium for it, you know? And then of course there's people that we lobbied for that just didn't make the book. So, you know, kind of picking and choosing your battles and what kind of case you're able to make for it, but the medium of that story becomes really important in whether or not it should be included or shouldn't be included. But I absolutely felt empowered to make those cases, which I think is the most important thing. I never felt as a team member that even if Afro-Latinos were not gonna be the majority of the book, that the rest of my colleagues wouldn't have heard me and listened to, you know, my case and really consider it.
I can jump in. So in a writer's room, as everyone is pitching stories, you know, creatively, the head writer or lead writer will make the ultimate decision. And sometimes it can be a little bit disappointing if the story that you were pitching doesn't quite go your way. And then when you get to production, I think it's very important to commit to the story that the lead writer has decided to tell. Some people, I think, have a hard time of letting go of their ideas, lots of times because they do come from personal experience. But I think in terms of after the writer's room, when everyone is on the same page, this is the story we're telling. I think it's very important that once you're in production to really get behind and embrace that story. Now, it may be a different point of view than your original point of view, but I think it's very important to commit to telling that point of view. Also, when you're working with talent, if everyone is on the same page, it also really helps talent, because then you can be very clear with them and help them. This is the story we're telling. These are the story beats that we want to hit. And so, although sometimes it can be disappointing that the story changes, I think it's best for the whole product in any creative medium. You know, your job is to commit to that story and help your talent understand the story beats, understand the emotional meaning behind it.
I had a little experience yesterday with that. I was writing a history paper. It's a history project. The prompt is, if you could have a dinner party and you could invite 8 historical figures to your dinner party, like who would you invite? So when I was starting, I was like, okay, they have to be 4 men and 4 women. Like it has to be equal. That's just kind of what I thought. But then as I was going on, like I developed my topic. It was about philosophy, you know, something about philosophy. And there are so few female philosophers in history. Like it's not fair, but that's just how it is. So if I wanted the conversation, you know, to be more interesting, that I gotta include those big male philosophers. So what I did was I had 2 female philosophers, Simone de Beauvoir and Mary Wollstonecraft, and I had them each sitting at like the center of the table, but like they would each be in the 2 halves of the table, like a long dinner table divided in half. So like each conversation would have a woman included. And I explained it in my paper. I was like, I seated them this way because I want women to be included in every conversation. You know, it doesn't have to be 50-50, but at least there should be 1 female voice represented in every table, in every conversation. So.
That's amazing. I want to remind everyone who's watching, you have an opportunity to ask questions of these amazing panelists. Use the Q&A box, should be somewhere near the bottom of your screen. We'll take questions soon. One thing that I'm interested in as well, someone said something about understanding like what the right medium is for your story. So how do you make the decision, knowing what story you want to tell, understanding the content of the story? How do you decide how your story will be best received? Like how to make it the best visual story it could be, the best sort of oral story it could be, whether it's writing, like how do you make How do you choose what medium is best for your story?
I'll kind of jump in there and say, I think this gets back to the collaboration question, because sometimes you can, well, I'll speak for myself. I can be so emotionally tied to like one story and one medium. Maybe that's just what I'm working on, like maybe I'm working on an exhibition, and so I think it's really important to surround yourself with honest people who will say, this may not work. And to Jen's point, the curator does generally have the final say to say, like, yes, I think it can, or no, I agree, let's just get rid of it. But I think it's important to have people around you just to give feedback. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're making the decision for you, but to hear other perspectives, because at least for me, so many of these stories become very personal. Like either I really like the story of a particular object and I want to make sure people know it, like the pen, right? I look at, once that book was done and I look at the book and I'm like, of course no one wants to look at a picture of a pen, right? Like, of course they don't, but there was another way to still tell that story. And I actually include that story in public presentations because I like it, But I also think seeing what's available to you, and to Aria's point, if it's not available to you, what kind of new mediums you can create. So I think, some of it is fitting the story to the medium that you're working on, and sometimes it's the reverse, right? Thinking of new mediums to tell the story that you really want to tell.
Yeah, I think for me, choosing my medium is about understanding my audience. I created my initiative, my youth-led initiative, Asians Lead, and we kind of knew at the beginning that it's going to target it towards, Asian American youth, people our age. So we started an Instagram page. We run an Instagram account and we constantly post, awareness raising stuff on our Instagram page, and we do story takeovers because that's what our generation sees, that's what we like. And recently, me and my other team, some other organization that I work with, we did like a TikTok video. What we did was, there's a trend on TikTok where you do like a makeover challenge. You take a makeup brush and you brush the camera and you kind of become all glam at all. So it's a makeover challenge, and we took that idea and we changed it to correcting gender equality myths. So what we did was we would take a makeup brush and we brush the camera and say like text on screen would say feminists hate men, and then would change to feminists believe in equality for all genders. So it's kind of like a creative way to get our point across. And I think our generation really, really loved that. Like that's how you reach out to teenagers and that's how you talk to them, because TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram, that's the apps that we check every day. And it's so easy to make, like anybody can succeed on social media. And I think it's so important to utilize those tools and to understand where the trend is going. So
I think this is such an amazing question. I come from a time where there was really only traditional media. So I think the fact that there are different types of platforms right now is really amazing. But creatively, I want to say that whether you want to be a writer or a director, there is a tremendous amount of value of getting your project done, from writing something from start to finish. From, if you have an idea, you can take your phone and you can direct a video, you can do Snapchat videos, you can do all these types of, use all these types of media to say what you want to say. A lot of people say they want to be writers, but they never really actually write something from start to finish. So I think it's very important to, whatever your goal is, whatever creatively you want to do, you can actually do it now. You can write your story. You can, even if you don't see yourself as a director, you can write it, you can direct it, you can get your friends to act in it, get it done, put it on YouTube, put it on Instagram, make your story, a minute and a half long. There is so much value in actually doing something from start to finish. And years ago, you know, you couldn't, if you wanted to make a short film, it would cost you, you know, $500,000. Use your iPhone. You know, have an idea, execute your idea. It can be a minute long, it can be 5 minutes long, it could be an hour long, but you have the power and you have the technology. You can be a storyteller using your own point of view, your own impulses, your own stories. There is such value in getting it done. Some people say it's not the most talented people that succeed, but it's the most ambitious people who succeed, who will do whatever they can do to get their project done.
I just wanted to I have a story about that, an exhibition story, but you know, I think that those are such important points about audience and accessibility of storytelling and creating stories now. So really interestingly, I used to work at the Anacostia Community Museum, and I did this exhibition about Latinx community growth. And so we had something about news media. And in one of the cases, I had a piece of this, like the technical production from, was it the early 1990s, Línea Directa, which is a Spanish language news program in DC. And so, I mean, I was born in 1980, so 1990 does not feel like a foreign concept to me, but I just thought it was so fascinating to me that of all the things in the exhibition, usually I thought people would be drawn to like, we had this art piece of La Virgen de Guadalupe with like an AK-47 or Celia Cruz and rollers, right? And these elementary school kids ran to this case and they're like, what is this? You know, but it was a really great conversation we had about what it took financially, right? And technically in order to create a news show in 1991. And they were just so fascinated. And so I really think, I mean, just in a short amount of time, for those of us who are older, it feels like, you know, you can have these multiple audiences and you can have this accessibility of story creation that just wasn't available to people before. And so I just really felt like that was worth reiterating, you know, because that's what my panelists are talking about, like the access to the creation of stories and direct access to your audience.
And I'll just jump in and say one more thing about that. Why I think it's so important to get a project done is you learn from that. You know, when you write something from start to finish, then you learn from that. And then if you actually shoot it on your phone, you learn like, oh, I could have done this differently. I could have done this differently. Like this would be better. It's such a learning experience.
Absolutely. We've got a lot of questions rushing in, so I want to give them a chance to hear some of their questions heard. Aria, this one is for you. Jen, Aria, feel free to jump in. How can you use storytelling to advocate for gender equality?
Okay. Wow, that's a good question. I think be vulnerable is so important in storytelling, especially when you're advocating for gender equality, because it's a concept that people have been talking about for so long. Like, you know, like every time you hear like everybody knows that men and women should be equal, but like how? Or like how is inequality affecting women? I think that's what a lot of people don't realize, because they don't realize that women and girls are suffering. Like they don't see how, because privileges are invisible to those who have it. So for many privileged people, they might not see what the other half is going through. So I think what's important is to show them what women and girls are going through, and you know, what the other half is doing. And I think that's the most important part. And when you tell a vulnerable story, when you be vulnerable to your audience, it's truly powerful. It breaks barriers. Like you build like a connection to your audience, because people are so tired of numbers or like, you know, statistics. They want to hear what real people are doing. They want to hear, you know, real stories, those genuine, authentic stories. I think those are the stories that really touch people, and those are the stories that can inspire people to take actions against those issues. So when you're advocating for gender equality, think about showing people how the world really is, and be personal and vulnerable. And I think that that's the way to move people and to change kind of the rhetoric for gender equality.
I can jump in a little bit there too. I think it's very helpful to just hold a mirror up and show people what you're experiencing in terms of gender equality. Like, for example, I have 2 children. They're now 18 and 21. But when they were little, they're 3 years apart. And so one was in 5th grade, one was in 8th grade. And at parent-teacher conferences, it was very interesting. The 8th grader was older, and I would hear, you know, he really takes charge. He's a real leader. He speaks up. And it was all in a very positive light. But then about my daughter, I would hear, you know, she speaks out of turn. She's a little bossy. They would sort of describe the same qualities. And for the boy, it was like, wow, he's bold and he's outspoken. And for my daughter, I was like, well, she's sassy and she's a little bossy. And they were the same kind of quality. So one time I turned around and I said, you know, I've just come from my son's conference and I've heard, you know, the same descriptions in a positive light. So I'm going to encourage my daughter to continue to be bossy, loud, and speak up. But even that is a little tiny example of you have, 2 kids in the same family, 3 years apart, going to the same school, and they were perceived in totally different ways. So any type of gender inequality that you are experiencing, I think if you hold a mirror up and show people what you're experiencing, it is really helpful because people can learn from that.
I would just add, in addition to what my panelists have said, that if we're recognizing gender inequity, like, I don't feel like my representations have to be balanced, you know? So I'm kind of thinking about your dinner party, Aria. Well, it doesn't have to be 4 men and 4 women, right? It can be all women. And so I really think about that when I'm giving presentations, and I try very much to, if I can, you know, depending on what my topic is, if I can only show women in the images, or if I'm only showing work by women creators, you know, just why not? My TED Talk was almost exclusively images of women, and it was exclusively images of women of color. Right? So if we're talking about what this inequity is, where am I empowered in my day-to-day job to shift that, even just a little bit, right? And so it was interesting because when I was practicing my TED Talk in particular with different colleagues, my white colleagues were just like, oh, you know, I get it. I don't feel like it pertains to me. And I was like, but you know, that's a point of discussion, right? Because we can see a white woman and say that represents women, but you see a Black woman and all of a sudden that only represents Black women, you know? And so just trying to get out of these stereotypical representations or these very narrow representations of who gets to represent what. And so even if I'm not talking about women, I very much try and center my images on women or from women, and just thinking about how we can shift narratives of inequity in that way as well.
I actually thought of another thing just hearing from my panelists. Like, so often we think of certain issues as women's issues, and we think like men and boys are not relevant. Like, they're just, it's women's issues, it's our thing, like other people are just irrelevant in the issue. And so I think it's so important that when we're talking about gender equality, we have to invite all genders into the conversation, because say like childcare, it's not a woman's issue, because it's not just the mother's child, it's the father's child too. And I think it's so important to open up that conversation and to look at it as a whole. Like, we as a human race, we as a whole body are facing this issue, not just half of the world's population, you know, because when women are not equal, how do you say that? Like, we're like, none of us are equal until all of us are equal. So I think it's really important to not only see women and girls as your audience, men and boys, or all other genders are your audience too. And it's very important to remember that when we're telling our stories.
Yeah, I think with that in mind, it's interesting. There are a lot of questions here about how, like, what steps you can actually take to uplift girls and women's stories, especially as we're talking about these inequities. So like any like practical things that storytellers out there can do to sort of elevate girls and women's stories, or the kinds of stories that they want to tell generally.
I can jump in. I'll say that, you know, kind of piggybacking on the last answer I gave, that's one way, you know, of making sure that you credit women, first of all, right? And that for me, it's always like, if someone asks me about something specific, how can I introduce something new to this conversation, and how can I uplift work that's already done, right? Because I think a lot of women's work goes uncredited, particularly in scholarship. Women are not cited as often as male authors. Women of color are not cited as much as white women, you know? And so just understanding where these inequities lie and what within your own, you know, everyday or professional, personal life you can do to kind of push that. So for me, it's definitely showing work by women creators. It's definitely showing images of women as representing more than just women, if a just women is a category. And then making sure that if I can bring other female colleagues into conversations I do, if I can cite work by colleagues or other women scholars in particular, I do. And especially just speaking up when you know women are being left out of the conversation. You know, I've talked before about how sometimes I'm the only woman in a room and it's just so uncomfortable. And I don't think it's something that other people always notice, you know? And so not taking for granted that everyone sees that imbalance and really just speaking it, right? Like, why am I the only woman in here, right? Or why am I the only Black woman in here? And it can make people a little bit uncomfortable, but if we're not willing to have these conversations out loud, nothing is gonna shift.
I also agree with Aria. It's very important to include men and boys in all these conversations, because sometimes they're simply just not aware. Like, I was often the only woman in the WWE writing room, and the men weren't, you know, sort of really aware of that. And also the other interesting thing is, when change happens, change is slow, but change will happen quicker if the majority group empowers the minority group. Like at the WWE, it has really been the men championing, I don't know why I couldn't say that word, but the men being champions for the women's stories. So I think it is very important to include men and boys, because sometimes a majority group is just not aware what it's like to not be in the majority. And true change really does happen when, like I said, in the WWE, it has really been the men who've really empowered the women to be equal to the men. And that's really, that's really been an amazing thing.
And I think one thing to keep in mind when we're creating stories is to toss out those, you know, misogynistic and traditional gender stereotypes that we're programmed in, like because I was, a personal story. I was directing a play in my school, and I had to like cast roles, and in the script it says it's a history professor, and they use the he pronouns. But I was like, well, this character, it's a minor character, and a professor doesn't have to be a man. Like it's totally gender neutral. And you know, I don't know why like the script is written that way, but when I had the power to cast actors, so I casted a female actor, and I think that's totally fine. Like, it doesn't affect the story at all. But sometimes when we're writing stories, or we're casting roles, or we're creating videos, whatever, it's so easy to fall into that gender stereotypes. It's so easy to like just think the traditional way. Oh, like a police officer is a man, or like a nurse is a woman. So I think it's important to keep in mind that it doesn't have to be that way. And that's how we break those barriers. That's how we break those gender stereotypes. So yeah, so I think that's a tip in storytelling.
There are a lot of questions questions here about how to find your point of view and, you know, where the confidence comes from to tell your story. So I wanted to make sure that you all had a chance to address that because it seems like a lot of people in our audience today want to know how to tell the story confidently. We've already told them, you know, if you want to be a storyteller, tell a story, right? But I think that lots of people are sort of struggling with like how to tell their story in a confident way, like how to sort of find a point of view and how to make sure that their story stands out. So I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on that.
I can jump in on that. As I talked a little bit before about what I think is talent, your talent really is who you are as a person. And you are important, and you just need to give yourself the power to believe in yourself and that the story you want to tell is important. And when it is your story, you will ultimately regret not. Everyone has that inner voice in their gut or in their heart. And I think give your permission to say that, like, I am worthy and my story is worthy. And when you think about storytelling or art, it's all about public perception. What one person loves, another person dislikes. So your point of view is just as valid as anyone else's point of view. Your point of view, your story that you want to tell or create is just as valuable as Martin Scorsese's next story he's going to tell, because it comes from you. And so just trust yourself and trust your inner voice, and because only you can write your story. And the way you imagine it, the way you perceive it, the way it means to you, the way it makes you feel. Go with your gut, go with how you feel. Everything is subjective. No one is ever gonna love every single story. And, if you can tell your story, just telling it and getting it done from start to finish is good enough. It doesn't have to win awards. You don't have to have everyone telling you it's great. Just committing and telling your story is good enough. You're important enough. What you have to say is important enough. Don't judge. Don't listen to the haters. There's always going to be haters. Do it the way it speaks to you, because it will be unique, and that is your talent.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in that too. I think one thing that I learned from my experience with Girl Up is that adults love hearing from us. Like, being young, like, you don't have any experience, it's fine, because actually, like, I know it sounds like weird, but they actually do. Like, adults are tired of hearing from like famous, successful people talking about issues for money or like for fame. But when young people are talking about issues, it's because we actually care about it. It's because we are passionate about it. So don't think that you're young and you don't have a college degree, you can't talk about things you care about, because you do, and people love hearing from us. So don't ever think that your story doesn't matter, because everybody's special, and know that your story is unique and only you can tell that. Also think of it as like a conversation with yourself. Like, when I'm telling my stories, it's like talking to myself. Like, I'm owning my history, I'm owning my background, my identities. And I think it's so important to realize that when you're telling stories, it's not just for your audience, it's for yourself too, especially if it's a personal story. Just think of it as like a self-improving journey. So I think that's how I make myself feel confident, is knowing that it's about myself. It's not only about the audience or how people think about me.
I'll just jump in. I agree with everything that my panelists have said. And I think some of that confidence too comes with knowing who you're telling the story for, whether it be for yourself or, who is your audience, and testing it out, right? Like, I know that there are people who are beautiful, extemporaneous orators. Like, I'm not one of those people. I go through multiple drafts, I write it down. I read it out loud so I can kind of hear what it sounds like, what it looks like. Are there places that I'm getting tripped up? Does it actually make the sense out loud that it does in my head? And test it, you know, on trusted people. And I think that's where your audience really comes in, is knowing, who do I want to connect with this story, or why am I telling this story? And just really being able to find like that soft place to land when you're still in your creative process, and making sure that you are surrounding yourself with encouraging people as you're testing out these ideas, especially if it's really personal, or especially if it's something that you don't feel super confident that you want to share with everybody yet. You know, find that group that you can share it with confidently, you know, personally, even if it's just 1 or 2 other people, or maybe it's just with yourself on video, you know, but practicing it so that you feel comfortable with whatever it is that you're creating. And that's when you're ready, you know, to share it with a larger group. But know your audience. Know your audience.
Well, I think that was a collective mic drop if I've ever heard one. I want to start wrapping up here. Any parting words, lasting advice that you want to give to our audience today? Aria, let's start with you.
Okay. I just want to say to all the girls my age who are storytellers and who want to be storytellers, be bold and be authentic, because your voice matters and it's important that people hear it. I think that's what Girl Up is about. It's amplifying girls' voice, and please do that, and don't ever waste your stories, don't waste your talent. Please use it, and please make the world hear what we have to say.
Jen?
So I would just say to all the young girls out there, you know, if you have a dream, you really can accomplish your dream. And I think the key, also you may know that your dream from time to time may change, but whatever you want to accomplish, you can do it. And I will say, you know, in a creative medium, there's a lot of talk about talent, and I've talked about, to me, what talent is, but also know that, you know, the people who succeed aren't always the most talented, quote unquote, talented people in the room. They're the people who never give up. If you have dreams and goals, take those steps, you will accomplish your goal. If you never give up and you keep going and you keep trying and you keep going and you keep trying, and when you get knocked down, you get right back up again. Just keep putting one foot in front of the other, and you really can do whatever it is you want to do. There is no goal, there is no dream that is too big. Just keep putting one foot in front of the other. That's just what I'd like to say, and I'd like to just wish everyone who's watching and listening just the best of luck. It's a very exciting time, and you can be the change you can make the change that you want to see. You can be the change that you want to see.
Love that. Ariana?
I guess I'll just say that everyone is a storyteller. I mean, honestly, there's no career that you can have in which effective communication and interesting narrative is not important, you know? And so it can be your personal story, it can be someone else's story, it can be the story of a piece of art or an object. Whatever it is that moves you, tell that story in whichever space and through whatever medium you feel empowered to tell it. I mean, absolutely every single person watching this is a storyteller. And so I hope that you've taken something from all of us to really just encourage your craft in whatever professional direction you choose.
Thank you all so much. This has been such an incredible conversation, really powerful nuggets that you guys shared today. So thank you for being a part of this. Thank you, our audience, for being a part of this. If you are a storyteller or want to be a storyteller, Girl Up can help with that. Check out our storytelling resources at girlup.org/storytelling. And we hope to catch you at our next Girl Talk. Bye, everyone.